Thanks, Alex. So I guess I'm gonna begin by just sharing my screen and we'll jump right into the presentation. Can everyone see my screen?
No.
No?
Maybe you have to turn off your camera.
How about, I think it should be working now.
Yep.
Yep,
Okay.
we can see it now.
All right, fantastic. So as was mentioned, we're going to be looking at women in the setting of conflict today. And specifically, we're hoping to apply a gendered lens to analyze how best to support survivors of conflict. Before we begin, we do want to share a quick content warning for mentions of sexual and gender-based violence that will appear throughout this presentation. To begin, as Alex mentioned, we'll be using the Rohingya crisis as our main case study today. In 2018, we looked extensively at gaps and barriers and best practices to gendered aid provision for the Rohingya refugee women and girls in Bangladesh. We spent over 50 hours conducting interviews with stakeholders from the NGO sphere representing major organizations, including some that you see on the screen here. These were then coded and turned into a policy report. The findings on this project will inform our understanding of conflict and gendered aid, which we will be discussing in this presentation. Although the Rohingya crisis is the main case study, we will also draw from other settings of ethnic conflict in Myanmar. So to begin, Sakshi will set the scene by examining the setting of conflict.
Thanks, Cassandra. So as Cassandra just mentioned, the question of conflict is not just limited to the Rohingya refugee crisis. We know Myanmar is a country marked by ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity, but at the same time, it has a complex history and conflicted history as well. There's about 135 recognized ethnic groups seeking political, economic, cultural, and social recognition. But there has also been armed conflicts in between Myanmar's ethnic groups, as well as involving the Myanmar military for decades now. And in thinking about the Rohingya refugee crisis, this is a really perfect example to examine conflict and gender. So some of us may know that Rohingya are amongst the most persecuted minorities in the world. They have been victim to ethnic cleansing and genocide for decades now. Although there have been records of Rohingya's presence in Rakhine State that go back to 8th century even, they're still not a recognized national race, and they have been deprived of their citizenship rights, claiming that they're immigrants that come from Bangladesh. So in August 2017, there was a really important event. There was a wide-scale military crackdown that displaced multiple Rohingya who escaped to Bangladesh, Cox's Bazar. So there was destruction of villages, the military performed arson, killing, looting, and other sexual and gender-based violence against the Rohingya refugees. So currently, although others have fled to neighboring countries, the world's largest refugee camp is in Cox's Bazar currently, and 1 million Rohingya refugees currently reside there. So what we're hoping to highlight today is that this long-standing civil war has made Myanmar an extremely unstable, unsafe, and unreliable setting that has exacerbated the developmental conditions for its civilians, and so thus establishing Myanmar in general as a conflict setting. So our primary argument today is that as a result of their gender, armed conflict has different impacts on individuals along the gender spectrum. And so when analyzing the Rohingya crisis, one good example is that due to the disproportionate killings of males, many families now in the Cox's Bazar refugee camps are female-headed. And about 60% of the individuals in the Cox's Bazar camps are women and children. Another important point to note is that it is widely acknowledged that rape and other sexual violence were used as a weapon of war by the Myanmar military. And there was one example, that one research study that we came across by the Human Rights Watch, where they interviewed 50 Rohingya women and girls about their experiences with sexual and gender-based violence. And through that study, they found out that all 50 but one of the rapes reported to the Human Rights Watch were gang rapes, involving two or more perpetrators, usually uniformed men in large groups that were performing these acts. But when we talk about gender and its different, when we talk about conflict and its different effects on different genders, we also need to acknowledge that there is a lack of data and services aimed towards male survivors of sexual violence. Another study that we came across was where there was a focus group discussion with 89 Rohingya men and adolescent boys, where 1/3 of them personally knew a Rohingya man or a boy who had directly experienced conflict-related sexual violence in Myanmar. And so there's almost double stigmas for male victims because there's a secondary trauma also of having broken the gender norms that expect men to be protectors or even the perpetrators of violence rather than the victims of it. And so there's a big gap in targeted interventions toward this that we will be highlighting through our several examples in our presentation today. So taking a step back a bit and analyzing conflict situations in general, in situations of conflict, humanitarian actors often rush to focus on survival, and gender is often an afterthought or is considered too much effort to think about at the very beginning. But what we need to understand is that conflict are inherently gendered because it takes place in a culture that assigns different roles to men and women. And these structures are often reinforced during wartime or during conflict, which can sometimes be detrimental to certain populations. So these are just a few examples to highlight how different individuals experience conflict differently as a result of their gender. And it concludes the background section of our presentation today, where we were hoping to elaborate first Myanmar as a conflict setting, and secondly, highlight how conflict impacts genders differently.
So with that and the problem that Sakshi has presented, we'll be discussing methodologies for how to address gendered vulnerabilities arising from conflict. Specifically, we'll be looking at gender mainstreaming and how it can be informed by intersectionality, and then we'll be applying it to 3 different intersections of identity with gender, looking at culture, age, and health status. And just to make the quick point that the Rohingya case studies come from our primary data during our research project, and we chose these 3 specific ones because they have explicit parallels with other ethnic minority groups from Myanmar that are very prevalent and well-known, so they might help further your understanding and draw parallels and relationships. And we also may use other conflicts in Myanmar to draw these examples as well. And then from there, we'll conclude and consider action items moving forward. So to begin, we'll start with gender mainstreaming and intersectionality. We recognize that this is a bit theoretical, so please hang tight. We promise it'll get more concrete. But to begin, gender mainstreaming, to define it, is simply a systemic response to systemic inequalities. It's a methodology where questions of gender sensitivities, vulnerabilities, and resilience are considered in every aspect of planning and implementing projects. Ultimately, the goal is to ensure that individuals of all genders' needs are met, their voices are heard, and their humanity is validated. But to be effective, gender mainstreaming has to be informed by intersectionality. And that itself is a framework to examine the multiple identities and life experiences a person may carry that result in multiple forms of oppression due to social marginalization. So to put that in perspective, for example, a Rohingya woman in Myanmar has to flee genocide, but a Buddhist woman maybe in Yangon may not. They're both women, but their intersection of their ethnicities shapes the difference between life and death. Furthermore, we see that conflict, as Sakshi mentioned, is a life-altering intersection, and we see this specifically with how it creates vulnerabilities for gender. So this means that we need gender mainstreaming to respond to those inequalities, and it needs to be informed by intersectionality to recognize these nuances in vulnerabilities. So from here, we recognize that this part of the presentation is a bit theoretical, so we'll now examine 3 critical intersectional identities using our field research from Bangladesh and what we learned from the Rohingya crisis. We'll apply these theories and ideas, and Sakshi will begin by examining the intersection of culture and gender.
Thanks, Kassandra. So the first intersection that we had is culture and gender. And it's really important to analyze how culture affects different people. So for example, it may impose limitations on Rohingya refugee women by allocating more agency to men than women. It may create certain power imbalances. And Although we know that patriarchy exists everywhere, including the West, we will be analyzing how intersecting circumstances that specifically Rohingya women are in allow for a unique set of barriers that may arise due to intersections with their identity, which is ethnicity, statelessness, and trauma post-genocide. So the example that we wanted to use today was of early child marriage. So this is just a cultural norm. And after starting menstruation, a girl is usually not allowed to leave the house and she's considered ready for marriage. In Myanmar, marrying off girls before the legal age of 18 is actually quite tricky. There are some requirements that are asked by the system. So they have to prove that the groom and wife have to be over 18. They need permission of local leaders and local offices of the government. This is still possible, and early child marriage is quite prevalent in Myanmar, but through bribery and other mechanisms. But overall, it's an expensive and a hazardous process. But post-conflict, or thinking about how conflict has affected this cultural norm, we can see that early child marriage is actually on the rise in the Bangladesh refugee camps. There's no effective legal barrier. There's no binding minimum age. Now all they need is to sign a piece of paper, follow some rituals in front of some witnesses, and they need the presence of a Maji. And a Maji is a community elected representative that is usually an authority figure. So they just need these three requirements and they're able to conduct these rituals. Now we know that early child marriage is seen as generally benefiting because of several reasons. For example, there may be one person less to feed, or the house is less crowded as it was before. But in a conflict setting, the setting of conflict thus incentivizes early child marriage for many families because they've already left their homes, they don't have any livelihoods, there's no formal income, and there's also lesser restrictions in place. And so early child marriage has been on the rise in the camps. And so our main point is that although we know that this is a prevalent issue and is bad for many reasons, only in examining the intersection of conflict and gender and culture are we able to see the change that occurs due to conflict. And in acknowledging this change, we can have specific interventions that are implemented, such as more oversight or making it tougher to partake in such activities, whether it's in an IDP camp or it's in a refugee camp across the border. So hopefully this highlights the relationship between culture, gender, and conflict well enough by elaborating that existing cultural practices that are already detrimental to a certain population are often worsened by conflict in some cases.
So another intersection that we can look at to make a similar point is age and gender. So throughout our research, we saw that as a result of their age, adolescent girls faced unique barriers to accessing resources, and they faced significant physical insecurities in Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar. So some of these include what's actually mentioned of early child marriage, but also being vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence, engaging in dangerous care work. This may include going to surrounding forests to collect firewood, or where there were reports of animal attacks or getting lost, or human trafficking, which is on the rise in these spaces. An example that we thought might help elucidate further this intersection and the risks that are associated with that age, gender, and conflict is looking at education specifically. So in Myanmar, the absence rates and dropouts rates of adolescent girls is fairly high. Even though there are schools there for young women and girls to attend, but this is because their lack of presence there is due to socioeconomic and cultural roots ranging from child marriage, child labor, seeing girls as necessary in the domestic sphere and not necessarily worthy of having an education, or there's no access to menstrual hygiene resources in the schools, so it's not accessible. But in the refugee camps, education facilities just didn't exist for adolescents across the board. And although this affects both women, young girls and young boys, what this means is that there's further vulnerabilities for girls because if they're not in school, then they're engaging in care work, they're being married off earlier, they're in spaces of physical insecurity, and they're vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. So from there, we would think that a quick fix would be to invest money in education. If anything, a feminist aid agenda would tell us that if you see a problem for gender, then you would invest in a solution. But we argue that this is a flawed approach because it attempts to see education as a fix for a gender problem, which is not the sole perspective. Instead, we argue that you need to attempt to mainstream gender into the education sector. Like any other sector, you would make it accessible to girls. So, for example, here, intersectional gender mainstreaming would recognize the status of many of these young girls as survivors of violence because of the conflict, consequent increases in early child marriage, human trafficking, wartime violence, and so much more. So if we're responding to that, we would not just need to invest in education, but we need female teachers that look like their students and speak their language to create spaces of trust. We would need teachers trained in psychosocial supports to be able to speak with students and provide opportunities for their health beyond just mental first aid. We need learning centers that are accessible for adolescent girls with latrines, hygienic waste management, and other necessities. We would also recognize that parents, because of child marriage or sexual violence, also qualify as children under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child because they're under 18. So to address if options can be determined for parents who wish to work while simultaneously learning and provide for their children is essential to recognizing this intersection of age, gender, and conflict. So fundamentally, without this lens, our analysis would have stopped at a bit of a superficial level, putting money into education. But addressing that conflict has shaped adolescent girls' lives and will continue to shape it in any sector they enter, aid and policy responses need to mainstream gender intersectionally in all elements of project conceptualization and implementation, as was explained here. And finally, Sakshi will be looking at the intersection of health and gender as well.
So by health and gender, we specifically mean health status and gender. So health status is a crucial identity that can further shape the experiences of individuals from different genders. And the one example that we wanted to explore today was persons with disabilities and their associations with gender in the context of the Kachin conflict specifically. So as we know, conflict can result in devastating loss of limbs or organs through conflict-related violence, or even large-scale displacement, as we have seen in the Rohingya refugee crisis. And often conflict can create new or exacerbate existing disabilities that people may have. So for example, in the Kachin community, men are considered the head of the family. They're the primary breadwinners and they're the protector of their family and their lands and any other valuables that they own. Kachin women are expected to be the homemakers and mothers and often organizers of family members and relatives, including caring for the old, the young, and the sick. So our main argument today is that conflict impacts conventional gender roles as well, and even more so for the persons of disabilities living in IDP camps by creating multiple additional challenges for them to overcome. So the impact of conflict on men's experiences and vulnerabilities are little understood. We came across a research study where a male person with disability from an IDP camp in Liza recounted how conflict has upset or disturbed the gender roles in the family, creating tensions. So he was unable to protect his family and lands from the conflict. Instead, while fleeing, his wife ended up protecting him by carrying him in a reversal of gender expectations. So the male here could not play the expected gender role because he could not perform the expected gender role as a protector of the family and as well as a protector of his property. So the reversals of gender norms in conflicts can result in relationship breakdown even. The first consideration here is obviously that accessible programming in general is often an afterthought. So we do need better structured and coordinated support urgently to improve mobility, to have accessible walking paths, to have accessible sanitization facilities, but also there need to be interventions that target these gendered norms because we're using a gendered perspective to analyze this issue. There was another study with about 161 interviews with 6 focused group discussions conducted with men and women with disabilities. And this rapid assessment found that current services at the most basic level are informed neither by a gender nor by a disabilities perspective. And so I guess in conclusion, you can relate health status, gender, and conflict, and how all need to be considered when designing interventions to meet the needs of persons with disabilities and target very specific issues.
All right, so from here, we want to think about the takeaways. What are the key considerations that we have to consider? So gender mainstreaming in policymaking specifically, since we're presenting to Global First Canada IDRC, is a commitment to considering intersections of gender in all elements of policymaking and projects. So this means elements of gender conceptualizing, implementing, and consulting, and of course, its intersection with conflict. So when we're looking at research and implementation, there are some key considerations we found throughout our research that we would like to share with you. The first is that data needs to be disaggregated by very prevalent intersections that were just dismissed often in research collection. So for example, knowing the marital status of children can help inform how they can be educated while being parents themselves, as we mentioned in the education sector. Knowing about differences in age, knowing about gender, knowing about disability, as Sakshi mentioned, helps inform projects so that we recognize what populations we can help and how. It also means including underrepresented genders in planning processes. So things that may seem gender neutral, like repatriation conversations, are often pretty gendered. For example, women, Rohingya women specifically, across the board, throughout our interviews, we found out did not want to return to Myanmar due to the atrocities they experienced, whereas some men still desired to return. So having underrepresented genders at the table to discuss their futures is essential to humanizing them and providing supports that they would appreciate. There's also an importance in considering gender mainstreaming and its intersectionality in creating accountability mechanisms. So for example, there were projects that were implemented, for example, to increase democratic participation rates for women, because a lot of time governance systems were based off of having like one male representative, as Sakshi mentioned, of a Maji, who speaks for maybe 5 to 7 different communities. And so in trying to create these participation processes where women would come together and make decisions with men, there were no further check-ins as to how often women were participating, if their voices were heard, if their ideas were actually implemented. So we need more qualitative analysis versus quantitative of saying, 7 out of 10 women came into these spaces and participated. Furthermore, funding should be dependent on check-ins and gendered progress reports and accountability structures. So a lot of the times we saw on the ground that gendered projects on paper implemented different intersections of gender, but when they were actualized, it failed to meet those requirements, but they were still funded and they still existed. So ensuring gender and its intersections are considered at every step of project planning is essential. And finally, we want to look at sustainability. The Rohingya crisis is not going away anytime soon, and neither are many of the ethnic conflicts happening in Myanmar. Conflict will always intersect with gender, and the vulnerabilities and resilience strategies need to consider that fundamental intersection. So in the long term, we need to think about how we humanize people, how we provide them voices, and how we not provide them voices, but amplify their own, and ensure that they have mechanisms for validating that humanity, whether it be access to justice or access to formal employment or access to education. There should be space for people to have legal recourse to injustices that they faced. And Sakshi will take us home.
Yeah, I guess so. Just to conclude, we wanted to break down our presentation in the form of 3 main takeaways. So the first one is that conflict can heighten and create vulnerabilities for different genders, often through exacerbating existing gender inequalities that exist in a society. So, and then the second takeaway is that gender mainstreaming is as an essential tool to address these vulnerabilities. And the third is that gender mainstreaming is mostly effective only when informed by intersectional lens. And this intersectional lens means considering other identities in addition to their gender. So we had examples of culture, we had examples of health status and age, but other intersections could be race, religion, sexual orientation, or even statelessness as an identity. So this lens in the context of conflict is really helpful in having targeted interventions to solve certain issues. And I guess to conclude, gender mainstreaming in general, if you have to understand the concept, is not just a line item in a funding proposal or a checkbox. It's not a top-down approach where there's a lot of policy on it, but nothing is implemented on the ground. Gender mainstreaming instead encourages reflection of gendered experiences and accountability at every step of the way. So, from policy to implementation to monitoring and evaluation, we are asking to think about these gendered experiences at every step of the way. And because conflict can add many new vulnerabilities and complexities to a situation, this gender mainstreaming and intersectionality are good at identifying and analyzing the experiences. So, because the first step is acknowledging the multidimensional nature of these inequalities, only then are we able to have targeted interventions and policies that attempt to eliminate these risks. And I guess to conclude, we just wanted to say that when victims of conflict have survived the odds of unthinkable violence and genocide and dehumanization even, it is a responsibility to consider their life experiences so as to meet their wants and needs and humanize them through our work at the end of the day. So, yep, that concludes it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is